The world ignores the man holding the mop. They don't see the exhaustion in his heavy eyes, or the generational genius hidden behind a faded blue uniform. But when a multi-billion-dollar tech empire faced absolute ruin, it wasn't an Ivy League executive who saved them. It was the night janitor. The fluorescent lights of the 72nd floor buzzed with a low, sterile hum. It was 2:15 a.m. in downtown Seattle. Arthur Pendleton dragged his heavy, industrial mop bucket across the polished concrete floor of Aegis Dynamics' Supreme Research and Development Wing. He wore a faded navy blue jumpsuit with pristine cleaners stitched over the breast pocket. To the executives who occasionally stayed late, Arthur was part of the furniture, a ghost who emptied their wastebaskets and wiped their whiteboards. Arthur, 34, with deep, premature lines framing his eyes, preferred being invisible. Invisibility meant no questions. No one asking why a former lead systems architect for a rising Silicon Valley startup was now scrubbing toilets for minimum wage. The answer was asleep in a pediatric ward 3 miles away. His 7-year-old daughter, Lily, had been diagnosed with severe aplastic anemia 2 years ago. The diagnosis came exactly 4 months after the horrific pileup on Interstate 5 that took the life of Arthur's wife, Chloe. Between the funeral costs, the sudden loss of dual income, and the brutal reality of the American healthcare system, Arthur's savings evaporated. His startup folded when he couldn't keep up the 80-hour weeks while practically living in the ICU. He declared bankruptcy, lost his house, and took the only job that allowed him to sit by Lily's hospital bed during the day and pay for her out-of-pocket experimental therapies by night. Arthur paused to wipe sweat from his forehead, leaning against his mop handle. Through the floor-to-ceiling glass walls, he looked out at the glittering skyline. Somewhere out there, Samantha Sterling was likely sleeping in a penthouse. Samantha Sterling was the 42-year-old billionaire CEO of Aegis Dynamics. The financial press called her the Iron Architect. She had built Aegis from a modest data storage company into a titan of quantum infrastructure. But lately, the financial columns were smelling blood in the water. Aegis had promised the Department of Defense a revolutionary quantum cooling server architecture, codenamed Project Icarus, capable of handling military-grade AI simulations without melting down. Delivery was 6 weeks away, and the rumor on the janitorial grapevine was that Icarus was a spectacular, combustible failure. Arthur pushed his cart into the main R&D war room. The air was thick with the scent of stale espresso and desperation. Desks were littered with empty takeout boxes, crushed Red Bull cans, and crumpled printouts. But it was the massive, 50-foot glass whiteboard spanning the back wall that caught Arthur's attention. It was covered in a chaotic web of thermodynamic equations, neural network logic trees, and frantic red marker circles. This was the brain of Project Icarus. Arthur began to empty the trash bins, deliberately keeping his eyes averted. He didn't want to look. Looking meant thinking, and thinking about code and engineering only reminded him of the life that had been violently ripped away from him. Yet, as he sprayed glass cleaner onto the adjacent conference table, his eyes drifted back to the center of the board. The R&D team had mapped out the thermal feedback loop. Arthur stared at the logic tree. His rag stopped moving. He walked slowly toward the glass. The engineers were trying to force the system to aggressively dump heat the moment the quantum cores hit 85 degrees Celsius. They had built a reactive algorithm. Idiots, Arthur thought, a dormant spark of his old self flaring to life. It's a cascading bottleneck. If you wait for the thermal spike to trigger the coolant, the latency in the valve actuation creates a microsurge. That's why the cores are frying. It was a classic predictive latency failure. The code didn't need to react. It needed to anticipate the load distribution based on the AI's memory allocation. Arthur looked around. The floor was completely deserted. The security cameras in the R&D war room were notoriously angled away from the whiteboards to prevent corporate espionage from compromised visual feeds. His hand trembled as he reached into the tray and picked up a black dry erase marker. It felt foreign, yet deeply familiar. He didn't erase their work. Instead, he found the empty space at the bottom right of the board. With swift, jagged handwriting, Arthur wrote out a predictive load-balancing algorithm. He bypassed their reactive thermal loop entirely, drafting 15 lines of elegant, brutal Python-based pseudocode that linked the cooling actuators directly to the CPU's task scheduler. He finished it with a simple differential equation calculating the delta-T variable for the coolant flow. He capped the marker, his heart hammering against his ribs. Panic suddenly washed over him. What had he done? If they caught him touching the IP, he'd be fired. If he lost his health insurance, Lily would be kicked out of the trial program. Arthur aggressively grabbed his rag, wiped away his fingerprints from the marker, shoved his cart out of the room, and didn't look back. The next morning, the executive boardroom on the 80th floor was a war zone. Samantha Sterling stood at the head of the long oak table, her tailored charcoal suit impeccable, her expression lethal. Across from her sat Gregory Hayes, the chief technology officer. Gregory was a silver-haired, silver-tongued executive placed by the board of directors. He was excellent at playing golf with defense contractors, but as an engineer, he was a relic. "The DoD is threatening to pull the contract, Gregory," Samantha said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "If Icarus fails another stress test today, Aegis stock will plummet 20% by the closing bell. I need a solution, not another slide deck explaining why physics is being difficult." Gregory adjusted his silk tie, offering a smug, self-satisfied smile. "Actually, Samantha, I was going to surprise you. My team and I stayed late last night. We cracked it." Samantha's eyes narrowed. "You cracked the thermal cascade?" "We did," Gregory proclaimed, projecting a photo of a whiteboard onto the monitor. "I realized we were approaching the latency from the wrong angle. I wrote a predictive load balancing algorithm that ties the cooling directly to the task scheduler. We ran the simulation this morning. The cores stayed at a frosty 62 degrees under maximum load." The boardroom erupted into sighs of relief. Samantha stared at the projected image. She zoomed in on the handwriting at the bottom right corner. "You wrote this, Gregory?" she asked softly. "I did," he lied smoothly. A moment of late-night inspiration. Samantha knew Gregory's handwriting. He wrote in looping, cursive heavy strokes. The code on the board was jagged, sharp, and written in all-caps block letters, the handwriting of an old-school systems architect who spent years writing on sticky notes. Furthermore, she knew Gregory barely understood Python, let alone the elegant, minimalist logic displayed on that board. It was a masterpiece of efficiency. "Brilliant work, Gregory," Samantha said, masking her suspicion behind a tight smile. "Deploy the update to the physical prototype. Let's see it run." As the room cleared, Samantha called her head of security, a towering ex-Marine named David. "David, pull the R&D corridor footage from last night, between midnight and 6 a.m. I want to see exactly who went into the war room." 10 minutes later, Samantha was in her private office, watching the playback. Gregory Hayes had swiped out of the building at 7:45 p.m. His entire team was gone by 8:30 p.m. The R&D suite was dark and empty for hours. Then, at 2:12 a.m., a man in a blue uniform pushed a yellow cleaning cart into the room. He emerged 20 minutes later, looking visibly shaken, practically running to the service elevator. Samantha zoomed in on the man's face as he passed the corridor camera. He looked exhausted, broken, yet there was an undeniable intensity in his dark eyes. "Get me the contractor manifest from Pristine Cleaners," Samantha ordered. An hour later, Arthur Pendleton's file was on her desk. The background check she ran was illuminating. 10 years ago, Arthur had been a rising star. He had co-authored a foundational open-source framework for neural networking. Then, a tragic gap in his resume. medical bankruptcy, and a total disappearance from the tech world. Samantha leaned back in her leather chair, tapping a manicured finger against her lip. Gregory had taken credit for a janitor's work to save his own skin. She could fire Gregory right now, but that would trigger a war with the board of directors just weeks before the DoD deadline. She needed absolute proof. More importantly, she needed to know if Arthur Pendleton was a one-hit wonder, or if the genius she saw on that whiteboard was just scratching the surface. She decided to set a trap. That evening, after the building cleared out, Samantha went down to the R&D floor. She erased a section of the main whiteboard. With her own red marker, she intentionally sabotaged the quantum tunneling sequence for the data transfer matrix. She created a localized data corruption loop, a problem so complex and deeply buried in the math that her senior engineers had spent 2 weeks ignoring it, hoping the DoD wouldn't notice. She turned off the main lights, leaving only the dim emergency LEDs glowing. Then, she retreated into Gregory's dark, glass-walled office in the corner of the room, leaving the door open just a crack. She sat in the dark, and she waited. At 2 a.m. precisely, the double doors swung open. The rhythmic squeak of the mop bucket wheels echoed in the cavernous room. Arthur walked in. He looked worse today, darker circles under his eyes, his shoulders slumped as if carrying a physical weight. Earlier that day, Lily's doctor had warned him that the experimental bone marrow treatment wasn't taking. They needed to pivot to a radical, vastly more expensive synthetic enzyme therapy. Arthur went about his work mechanically. He emptied the bins, he wiped the desks, he mopped the floor. He clearly tried to avoid looking at the whiteboard. He kept his back to it, but the red marker Samantha had used practically glowed in the dim light. As he passed the board to clean the eraser tray, he stopped. Samantha held her breath in the darkness of the office. Arthur stared at the red equations. He tilted his head. He let out a heavy, frustrated sigh, the sound echoing loudly in the quiet room. "Don't do it," Arthur told himself. "Keep your head down. Go back to the hospital." But the equation was wrong. It was offensively, fundamentally flawed. It was like a musician hearing a violently out-of-tune piano. The urge to fix it was biological. Arthur slowly reached out. He picked up a blue dry erase marker. He didn't even bother to erase Samantha's work. He just started writing right over it, slashing through her red variables, correcting the matrix, rewriting the quantum tunneling sequence in real time. His hand flew across the glass, the squeak of the marker rapid and frantic. For exactly 4 minutes, Arthur wasn't a broken, grieving father scrubbing floors. He was a maestro conducting a symphony of logic. He finished, capped the marker, and let his arm drop. "You missed a decimal point on the tertiary variable." A voice echoed through the dark room. Arthur froze. His blood ran ice cold. The marker slipped from his fingers, clattering loudly against the floor. Samantha Sterling stepped out of the shadows of the corner office. The ambient light caught the sharp angles of her face. She walked slowly toward him, her heels clicking methodically against the concrete floor he had just mopped. Arthur backed away, his hands instantly going up in surrender. I'm sorry," he stammered, panic gripping his throat. "I was just cleaning. I didn't mean to, I'm sorry. Please don't call my supervisor. I need this job. I have a daughter. She's sick. Stop," Samantha commanded softly. She walked past him and stood in front of the whiteboard. She studied the blue inks. Her eyes widened slightly. He hadn't just fixed the data corruption loop. He had optimized the entire data transfer protocol, reducing the processing load by an estimated 30%. She turned to look at him. The man was trembling, terrified of losing a minimum wage cleaning contract. "Arthur Pendleton," Samantha said, using his full name. Arthur stopped breathing. "How do you know my name?" "I know that you designed the Helix framework 10 years ago," Samantha said, her gaze piercing through him. "I know that Gregory Hayes stole your code this morning and presented it as his own to save his miserable career. And I know that what you just wrote on this board is better than what a team of 70 MIT graduates has produced in a year." Arthur swallowed hard, staring at the billionaire. Are you firing me? Samantha stepped closer, her expression shifting from corporate ruthless to something intensely calculated. Arthur, she said, her voice dropping lower, I am not firing you. In fact, I'm about to make you a very dangerous offer. A dangerous offer, Arthur repeated, his voice barely a rasp over the hum of the servers. He tightened his grip on the handle of his mop, the plastic digging into his calloused palms. I scrub floors, Miss Sterling. I empty your recycling bins. I don't do dangerous. Samantha Sterling stepped closer, the ambient blue light of the emergency LEDs casting sharp shadows across her face. You don't scrub floors because you're uneducated, Arthur. You scrub them because you're hiding. I had David, my head of security, pull your full dossier an hour ago. I know about your startup, Ether Logic. I know about the crash on Interstate 5. And, she paused, her voice losing its corporate edge, softening into something dangerously empathetic. I know about Lily. I know she's at Seattle Children's Hospital, and I know her body is rejecting the standard bone marrow grafts. Arthur felt the floor tilt beneath him. The mop clattered to the floor. Don't, he breathed, a fierce, protective anger suddenly overriding his fear. You don't bring my daughter into this. You don't have the right. I have the right to solve my company's existential crisis, and you have the right to save your child, Samantha countered, unflinching. Doctor, Eris Fowler at Johns Hopkins just opened a clinical trial for a synthetic enzyme therapy that directly targets severe aplastic anemia. It's not covered by insurance. The buy-in is $2.4 million. Arthur stared at her, his chest heaving. He knew about the Fowler trial. It was the holy grail a treatment with a 90% remission rate. It was also financially impossible. He had spent nights weeping in his rusted Honda Civic just thinking about it. Aegis Dynamics will wire the $2.4 million to the Johns Hopkins Trial Consortium by 8 a.m. tomorrow, Samantha said, her tone absolute. Lily gets a dedicated medevac flight to Baltimore. She gets the treatment. And you get to breathe again. In exchange for what? Arthur asked, the cynical tech veteran in him waking up. I write your code? You rewrite the entirety of Project Icarus, Samantha corrected. But here is the catch, Arthur. You cannot exist. The board of directors is actively looking for a reason to oust me. They installed Gregory Hayes as CTO to be their golden boy. If I fire Gregory 3 weeks before the Department of Defense demonstration and replace him with a night janitor, the board will trigger a vote of no confidence and strip me of my own company. Wall Street would panic, the stock would tank, and Aegis would be liquidated by private equity. Arthur began to see the architecture of her plan. It was as elegant and ruthless as the code he had just written. You want Gregory to think he's succeeding. I want Gregory to dig his own grave, Samantha corrected, a cold fire in her eyes. He took credit for your work today. He's incredibly arrogant and fundamentally lazy. He will gladly let his anonymous late-night muse fix his problems while he plays golf with generals. You will continue to clock in for pristine cleaners. You will push your cart. But your real work will happen in sub-basement C. There is an air-gapped server terminal there. You will build Icarus. You will feed the patches directly to the main compile via a backdoor I will open for you. Gregory will present the flawless code to the board, entirely ignorant of how it actually works. And when the DoD demo happens? Arthur asked. When the demo happens, Samantha said, a slow, predatory smile touching her lips, I will ensure Gregory is asked to explain the quantum cooling matrix live, on stage, in front of a room of 3-star generals. When he chokes, I expose him. I clean house. And you step out of the basement as the new Chief Technology Officer of Aegis Dynamics. Arthur looked at the whiteboard, then at the billionaire CEO standing before him. The exhaustion in his bones was suddenly replaced by a surging, electric adrenaline. Deal, Arthur said. The double life began the next evening. At 9 p.m., Arthur pushed his cart through the gleaming lobbies of Aegis Dynamics. To the late-working executives, he was invisible, But at midnight, he descended to sub-basement C, swiping a ghost keycard Samantha had slipped him. The sub-basement was a concrete bunker, cold and dead quiet, housing legacy servers. In the center sat a single, high-end terminal workstation. For the next 6 hours, Arthur didn't just code, he conducted warfare. He tore down Gregory's bloated, reactive logic trees and rebuilt them using hyper-efficient, predictive algorithms. He felt a profound, almost spiritual relief. For 2 years, his brilliant mind had been trapped in a cage of grief and ammonia. Now, he was flying. And he wasn't flying alone. Every night, at 2 a.m., the heavy metal door of the bunker would click open. Samantha Sterling would step inside, trading her intimidating tailored suits for cashmere sweaters and slacks, carrying 2 steaming cups of dark roast coffee and paper bags of late-night Thai food. "Status report, Mr. Pendleton," she would say, pulling up a folding chair next to his terminal. "The thermal feedback loop is stabilizing," Arthur would reply, accepting the coffee. "Your CTO is an absolute butcher, by the way. His base syntax looks like it was written by a concussed squirrel." Samantha laughed, a genuine, unguarded sound that Arthur realized few people ever got to hear. As the weeks bled on, the sterile bunker became a sanctuary for both of them. They bonded in the trenches of extreme stress. Arthur learned that Samantha had built Aegis from nothing, fighting tooth and nail against a male-dominated industry that constantly tried to minimize her. She learned about Chloe, about the crash, and about the crushing, lonely terror of being a single father to a dying child. "You didn't just lose your wife, Arthur," Samantha said softly one night, watching his hands fly across the keyboard. "You lost your voice. This industry took your company when you were bleeding, and it didn't even blink." Arthur paused, looking at her in the dim light of the monitors. For the first time in years, he felt seen, not pitied, but recognized. The tension between them shifted, charged with a quiet, undeniable magnetism. He reached out, his hand hovering over the mouse, and his knuckles gently brushed hers. She didn't pull away. "Lily started the enzyme infusions yesterday," Arthur said, his voice thick with emotion. "Dr. Fowler said her white blood cell count is already showing signs of stabilization. I owe you my life, Samantha." "You don't owe me anything," she whispered, her gaze locking onto his. "We're partners. We're building something real." But 3 floors above them, the illusion was beginning to crack, and karma was preparing to collect its debts. Gregory Hayes was many things: arrogant, manipulative, and technically inept, but he was not entirely stupid. He possessed the sharp, paranoid instincts of a corporate survivor. With only 8 days left until the Department of Defense demonstration, Gregory sat in his glass-walled office, staring at his monitor in a cold sweat. The Icarus project was performing flawlessly in the simulation sandbox. The board of directors was hailing him as a visionary. The defense contractors were clamoring for early meetings. There was only one problem. Gregory had absolutely no idea how the code worked. Every morning, he arrived to find the GitHub repository flooded with thousands of lines of pristine, aggressively optimized code, submitted under a ghost admin credential. At first, he assumed it was one of his overworked senior engineers, afraid to speak up. But when he discreetly audited his own team, none of them had the skills to write this. The mathematics were beyond Aegis's current capabilities. It was alien technology. Panic set in during a preliminary brief with the board. A director had asked him a basic question regarding the differential equations in the coolant flow protocol. Gregory had fumbled, using corporate buzzwords to deflect. He saw the slight narrowing of Samantha Sterling's eyes from across the table. "She knows," Gregory realized with sudden, icy clarity. "She's playing me." Gregory locked his office door and booted up a private, heavily encrypted terminal. He didn't use Aegis's internal security network. Instead, he hired a black hat forensic trace program off the dark web, paying with his personal offshore funds. He set the program to monitor the internal IP traffic the next time the Ghost admin committed a code update to the Icarus repository. He stayed in his office until 3 a.m., hiding in the dark. At 3:15 a.m., his monitor flashed green. A massive data packet was being uploaded to the root server. Gregory tracked the IP address. It wasn't bouncing from Russia or China. It was coming from inside the building. Sub-basement C. Gregory slipped out of his office, bypassing the elevators, and took the concrete fire stairs down into the bowels of the building. When he reached the sub-basement, he peered through the reinforced glass window of the server room door. What he saw made his blood run cold. There, sitting at an off-the-books terminal, typing at a blistering pace, was the night janitor. And leaning over his shoulder, pointing at the screen and smiling, was Samantha Sterling. Gregory backed away from the door, his mind spinning furiously. The CE key and the janitor. It was a setup. Samantha was using the janitor to build the system, bypassing him entirely, waiting for the perfect moment to execute him publicly. A lesser man would have resigned. But Gregory was a cornered animal, and cornered animals bite. He retreated to his office and made a phone call on a burner cell. He didn't call the board. He called Marcus Vanguard, the cutthroat managing director of Apex Strategic Aerospace, Aegis's fiercest rival in the defense sector. "Marcus," Gregory whispered into the phone, "I have the Icarus architecture. Fully functional. I want 30 million wired to a Cayman account and a VP position, and I will hand you the master compile on a silver platter." "You're under contract, Gregory," Vanguard's voice crackled back. "Aegis will sue us both into oblivion." "Aegis won't own it," Gregory sneered. "I'm going to wipe the Aegis mainframe the night before the demo. I'm going to make it look like a catastrophic cyber attack perpetrated by a disgruntled minimum wage employee. By the time the dust settles, Aegis will lose the DoD contract, their stock will hit zero, and Apex can unveil the miraculously recovered tech as their own." Vanguard laughed. "You have 48 hours to deliver the compile." The next night, Samantha was at a charity gala, forced to maintain public appearances. Arthur was alone in sub-basement C, finalizing the root access protocols for the DoD demonstration. The heavy metal door didn't click open softly. It was shoved violently wide. Arthur spun around to see Gregory Hayes standing in the doorway, flanked by two towering, unsmiling men in tactical gear, private security, off-the-books muscle. "Hello, Mr. Pendleton," Gregory said, stepping into the room. He looked at the discarded janitor's uniform draped over a chair, then at the sprawling brilliance of code on the monitors. "I must say, I'm impressed. A bit cliché, the hidden genius pushing a mop, but effective." Arthur stood up slowly, his muscles tensing. "You're not supposed to be down here." "Neither are you," Gregory snapped, his smug facade dropping to reveal pure malice. He pulled a silver, encrypted hard drive from his pocket and tossed it onto the desk in front of Arthur. "Here is the new reality, Arthur. You are going to compile the master source code for Project Icarus and load it onto that drive. Then you are going to write a highly destructive wiperworm virus into the Aegis mainframe." "You're out of your mind," Arthur said, his voice steady despite the hammering in his chest. "If you destroy the mainframe, the DoD walks away. Aegis goes under." "That is exactly the point," Gregory smiled coldly. "I won't do it." Gregory chuckled, a dry, hollow sound. He pulled a tablet from his briefcase and tapped the screen. He turned it around. It was a live feed of a hospital room. Lily was asleep, hooked up to an IV drip, surrounded by specialized medical equipment. Arthur's heart stopped. The air vanished from the room. "I am the chief technology officer of this company," Gregory whispered, stepping into Arthur's personal space. "I have override access to all vendor accounts, including the philanthropic disbursements. It takes me exactly one keystroke to cancel the $2.4 million wire transfer to Johns Hopkins. It takes a second keystroke to flag the initial payment as corporate fraud, triggering a federal freeze on the hospital's accounts. Gregory leaned in, his breath smelling of stale mints and scotch. You compile that code for me, Arthur, and you take the fall for the cyber attack. You go to federal prison for a few years, but your daughter lives. You refuse, and the medical payments stop tonight. They discharge her tomorrow. She's back in a public ward by the weekend, and we both know she won't survive the month. Arthur stared at the screen, at the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of Lily's small chest. The rage that boiled up inside him was nuclear, but it was instantly smothered by absolute, paralyzing terror. He had fought so hard. He had sacrificed his pride, his career, his identity, all to keep that little chest moving. Gregory had him pinned. It was a perfect, inescapable checkmate. With trembling hands, Arthur reached out and picked up the silver hard drive. He plugged it into the terminal. "Good boy," Gregory sneered, patting Arthur's shoulder patronizingly. "Compile the root. Don't leave out a single line." Arthur sat down. He began to type, tears of pure, impotent rage blurring his vision. He was betraying Samantha. He was destroying the company that had given him a lifeline. But as he looked at the code, a dormant, dangerous thought sparked to life in the back of his mind. Gregory Hayes thought he understood power. But Gregory Hayes didn't understand the architecture of code. He didn't realize that when you build the machine from scratch, you don't just know how it works. You know exactly how to make it explode. The morning of the Department of Defense demonstration, the Aegis Dynamics auditorium buzzed with the tense, electric energy of a billion-dollar execution. General Thomas Caldwell, a decorated logistical commander from the Pentagon, sat in the front row, flanked by an entourage of stern-faced defense analysts. At the podium stood Gregory Hayes. He wore a bespoke Italian suit, projecting the unearned confidence of a man who believed he had just successfully rigged the universe in his favor. To his right, sitting in a leather chair, was Samantha Sterling. Her expression was a mask of cold, terrifying calm. Deep in the shadows of the lighting booth at the back of the auditorium, Arthur Pendleton watched. He was no longer wearing his faded blue, pristine cleaner's jumpsuit. He wore a crisp charcoal suit Samantha had messengered to his apartment that morning. "Ladies and gentlemen of the Defense Department," Gregory announced, his voice echoing through the state-of-the-art sound system. "Today, Aegis Dynamics redefines the limits of computational thermodynamics. I present to you the fully operational quantum cooling matrix of Project Icarus." Gregory dramatically pressed the enter key on his console to initiate the live simulation. He expected one of two things to happen. Either the system would boot flawlessly, allowing him to take the credit before he defected to a rival contractor, or Arthur's wiper worm would detonate, crashing the Aegis servers and giving Gregory his perfect alibi. Instead, the massive 50-foot screen behind him entirely black. General Caldwell leaned forward, narrowing his eyes. "Mr. Hayes? Is there a technical issue?" "Just a minor display latency, General." Gregory chuckled nervously, tapping his keyboard. He tapped it again, harder. He realized he was locked out of the root directory. Then, lines of green code began raining down the black screen, cascading with violent speed. But it wasn't a simulation. It was an audio file, heavily encrypted and tied to an executable script. The speakers crackled, and a voice filled the silent auditorium. "I am the Chief Technology Officer of this company," the recorded voice sneered. It was unmistakable. It was Gregory. "I have override access to all vendor accounts. It takes me exactly one keystroke to cancel the $2.4 million wire transfer to Johns Hopkins." Gregory's face drained of all color. He backed away from the podium, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. The recording continued, every syllable echoing with damning clarity. "You compile that code for me, Arthur, and you take the fall for the cyber attack. You refuse, and the medical payments stop tonight. She won't survive the month." A collective gasp rippled through the rows of defense analysts. General Caldwell stood up, his jaw clenched in absolute fury. On the screen, the green text shifted, transforming into a live, split-screen data projection. On the left side were the irrefutable IP logs showing Gregory Hayes transferring a massive, highly classified data packet to an unauthorized offshore proxy server. But Arthur had not given Gregory the source code. Arthur was a master architect. When Gregory forced him at the terminal, Arthur hadn't compiled Icarus. He had compiled a localized mirror environment, a Trojan horse. Gregory thought he was stealing the future of quantum computing. He had actually downloaded a self-executing confession protocol that triggered the moment he tried to run it on a public network. "Turn it off!" Gregory screamed, lunging for the power cables beneath the podium. Before his hands could reach the cords, David, Samantha's towering head of security, stepped out from the wings and firmly clamped a hand onto Gregory's shoulder, hauling him backward. Two federal agents, who had been quietly embedded in General Caldwell's entourage for a routine background audit, were already moving down the aisle, handcuffs drawing from their belts. "Gregory Hayes," General Caldwell said, his voice like grinding stone. "You are under arrest for federal extortion, corporate espionage, and attempting to defraud the United States military." As Gregory was dragged from the auditorium, kicking and shouting empty threats, a heavy, stunned silence fell over the room. The billion-dollar deal was hanging by a thread. The DOD was ready to walk out the door. Samantha Sterling stood up. She walked to the podium, perfectly composed, the predator who had just successfully defended her territory. "General Caldwell," Samantha said, her voice clear and unwavering. "Aegis Dynamics does not tolerate corruption. But more importantly, we do not tolerate mediocrity. The man you just saw arrested was a fraud. He did not build Project Icarus." She gestured toward the back of the auditorium. "Allow me to introduce the man who did. Our new Chief Technology Officer, Arthur Pendleton." Arthur stepped out of the shadows of the lighting booth and walked down the center aisle. His heart hammered against his ribs, but his spine was straight. He walked past the rows of stunned executives who, just yesterday, had ignored him as he emptied their trash. He took his place at the podium beside Samantha. "General," Arthur said, his hands flying across the console, unlocking the true directory. "Let me show you what real architecture looks like." He launched the actual Icarus compile. The screen ignited in brilliant, high-definition thermal imaging. The simulation ran a stress test that was double the military requirement. The cooling matrix anticipated every thermal spike, adjusting flow rates with zero latency. The quantum cores remained at a frosty, stable 60 degrees. It was a flawless symphony of mathematics. General Caldwell stared at the screen, then looked at Arthur, a slow, deeply impressed smile spreading across his face. "Mr. Pendleton, you just saved Aegis Dynamics." 6 months later, the afternoon sun streamed through the wide windows of the Johns Hopkins Pediatric Recovery Wing. Arthur sat beside a hospital bed, watching his daughter, Lily. Her cheeks, once pale and sunken, were flushed with color. The synthetic enzyme therapy had worked perfectly. Her white blood cell count was completely normal. She was in full remission, currently deeply focused on coloring a picture of a dragon. The door opened softly, and Samantha stepped into the room. She wasn't wearing a corporate suit, but a simple, elegant sundress. She carried a massive bouquet of bright yellow sunflowers. "Hey," she whispered, setting the flowers on the nightstand. "Hey," Arthur smiled, standing up. Lily looked up, her eyes brightening. "Aunt Sam!" Samantha laughed, leaning down to inspect the drawing. "That is a very fierce dragon, Lily. Are you ready to go home tomorrow?" "Dad said we get to get a dog," Lily announced proudly. Samantha raised an eyebrow, looking up at Arthur. "Oh, did he?" "A small one," Arthur amended, rubbing the back of his neck. Samantha stepped closer to him. The electric tension that had always hummed between them in that dark sub-basement was no longer fueled by desperation, but by a profound, hard-won peace. She reached out, her fingers gently intertwining with his. He squeezed her hand, anchoring himself to the reality he had fought so hard to reclaim. They had built an empire together in the dark, and now they were finally standing in the light. The world often overlooks the people quietly holding it together, dismissing brilliance if it doesn't wear the right uniform. Arthur Pendleton's journey from a grieving, invisible janitor to a titan of industry proves that true genius cannot be permanently erased by tragedy. Sometimes, the most complex equations aren't found in code, but in the relentless, enduring power of a parent's love and the sharp justice of undeniable karma.